welcome to Writer to Writer. I'm Bea Davenport, your host, and joining us today, we're talking with Lenore Hart and Deborah Morris. Thanks for joining us. A lot of people out there have always had dreams of becoming an author, of writing the great American novel, or maybe the not-so-great novel, just to get their name out there in print. Let's start out and just find out how you got started writing. How did you get started, Lenore?
Well, I studied writing, actually, in college, and I was first a poet professionally. I was a poet in the schools, in the artists in the schools
Not many of those
program.
around.
No, especially getting paid for it.
Yeah.
I was very lucky. And I did that for a few years, and then the grant money kind of dried up during a Republican administration I won't name, but anyway.
Please.
Yes. Anyway, I went back to school and took various jobs. I was a librarian, but during all that time I was writing, and I had switched in the meantime to fiction and completed a novel. And I did it mainly on my drive to work because I had a long drive back and forth.
Did you do it in a tape recorder?
No, I did it in my head, and that's when it finally
good.
got out of hand, and I couldn't remember all the characters and what was going to happen next, and I started collecting notes, and I suddenly realized that I had a novel. There was this, this thick file, and finally I was committed, so I ended up doing it that way.
I had visions of Lenore in traffic with this little pad, people cutting her off in
driving in the wrong lane.
But that's a pretty big switch to go from poetry. You picture a certain thing in your mind, Tennyson, Yeats, when you're talking about poetry. Yeah. Then all of a sudden we're Stephen Kinging it,
Yeah, well, I think I always had that recessive horror gene in there somewhere. I think it kind of cropped out in the poetry too. But I was talking to a school today, and I was trying to explain it to them, and I said, I think it's like a poem is like you're riding in a train and you see a glimpse of something, wonderful or terrible out the window, and boom, it's gone. But a novel is like the whole journey, start to finish, the slow parts, the fast parts, everything. And I think I wanted to experience the whole journey for a change, and that's what.
Was it like a different message you were trying to tell? I think, like you said, in poetry, it's kind of an encapsulated view, just a flash. But a lot of it seems to have the same reoccurring themes.
That's true.
Women being rescued by the valiant knights, or variations thereof, love, romance.
I think those themes carry over. I think I'm just more long-winded, I think. I wanted a chance to keep on talking, and you couldn't do that in a poem, so.
Now, what about your work? You're writing true-to-life stuff. Mm-hmm. How did you get started on that? People write about what they know. Have you had many true-life adventures?
A funny thing happened on the way to vacation one summer. We had just adopted our youngest son, and we were on our way to take him to meet all of his new family in Florida. And we were coming along I-10 when a tractor-trailer ran our van off the road, through a guardrail, end over end, down into a ravine at 65 miles an hour. And that was one of those moments where you look down on top of trees and you think, it's over, this is it.
Wow.
Children are screaming in the back, and all of a sudden glass is exploding and the world is going around, and you assume it's over. We got to the bottom, we landed back on our wheels after rolling and rolling, and lo and behold, everybody was alive. We climbed out the windows. Not only were we alive, we were all unscathed. No broken bones, no stitches. We had tiny glass splinters. There was nothing left of our van, and everything in our van that wasn't tied down had been tossed out the windows and crushed by the van to like igloo coolers this high.
Obviously you were wearing seatbelts.
We were all wearing seatbelts.
Good for you.
We were all wearing seatbelts. So I had already been interested in writing. I had started being interested in writing as a child. I had decided to go for it at a certain landmark birthday, which shall remain undisclosed. And I had already sold several articles, some humor columns, a few things, but I was really just starting. And after that incident, I went home and I wrote about our experience and sent it into Guidepost magazine, which is a small inspirational magazine. And they accepted it, and they printed it.
Sure.
Yeah. And so from there, my editor at Guideposts told me I should call a certain editor over at the Digest, Reader's Digest.
I was going to say, it sounds like a drama in real life to me.
And he said that I should be writing for them, and I did what he said, and the next thing I knew, I was writing regularly for the Digest, which then led very quickly into the books, the juvenile books that I'm doing that are all real-life adventures.
Now, it's interesting that they are juvenile books. I think for some people, now not for you, obviously, because you are writing juvenile books, but some people it's difficult to talk to children. It's difficult to get that kind of level going where you don't talk down to them, you're not talking too intellectually for them, but you still have a good value message. And obviously, you've taken to it like a duck to water. Any hurdles that you had to overcome?
No, I have 4 kids of my own from 11 to 18, and they all have 16 friends that practically live with us. I have no problem communicating with children.
And of course, they make a great critical audience.
I don't send anything in. Yeah, I don't send anything in until all my kids read it.
How about that?
That's your writer's workshop.
That is.
Exactly. And you've got 4 kids. And you've got 1.
I've got one.
Now, it seems to me that it would be very difficult to find the time, the isolation. I would assume, you know, that you would sequester yourself in a small room with your computer and just kind of get to work. But if you've got children in your house, now that must be pretty hairy. How do you deal with that, Lenore?
Well, it is. Well, mine is 2 for starters, so that makes it real hairy. Yeah, I mean, she's only 1, but, I mean, there's only 1 child, but, yeah, it does make it hard because I used to think I had to have complete silence, you know, to work. I mean, quiet, but there's no such thing anymore. I mean, there really is no such thing, but now there really is no such thing. You know, and we finally ended up hiring someone to watch her in the house. You know, it's sort of like a little preschool going downstairs while we're working upstairs. And I sort of had to become accustomed to the squeals and the, you know, and the nursery rhymes and all that. In fact, I sometimes incorporate them in my novels. So, but yeah, it's children and writing really are not compatible. I mean, I truly believe that, and I think that goes a long way to explain why there were so few women writers up until say this century, when it, you know, when it became more, you know, common or more accepted to have sitters and nannies, whatever, watching your, you know, you cannot write and watch children, even one child, because there's no, your train of thought is constantly being interrupted, and that is really death to fiction or nonfiction, I would think. I mean, you can't choose words when, you know, someone's saying, well, what about this, or what about, you know, or I want a pop, you know, I want a lollipop. I mean, you just can't, you can't concentrate, yeah.
And you've got the Osmond family running around.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. That isn't as much of a problem for me. Sometimes, if I'm working on a specific passage that's difficult, interruptions bother me. But probably because I have so many kids, and because I've had so many kids around for so many years, I'm pretty comfortable with just dealing on 2 levels. You know, I can type and write and tell them yes or no to where they can go and what they can do and when they have to be back, kind of all at the same time. And unless I'm on a very difficult passage, I can still do that. Now, mine, it's easier because mine are all in school. So during the school year, I have those daytime hours until mid-afternoon. In the summer, it becomes a circus.
I bet it does.
But I don't need absolute quiet. I just need some semblance of occasional peace. Right. And I can get by with that.
It seems like you would reach a crux in your story, and you'd just be like, okay, everyone take a time out.
Well, at that point, I close the door. My office has a door. I normally leave it open.
Lucky. I don't have
a door. My husband built a door for me.
My office is locked. Thick one. There's no door.
And there's no escaping.
My husband installed a thick door with a lock, but I only use it in crises. So,
tell us about your book, Black River, Lenore. Okay. Well, it's set in North Florida, and I think I chose that setting. Although I'm from Central Florida, it's changed so much, you know, in the past, well, 20 years. What I wanted to do was try to preserve something of the old Florida, yet set it in contemporary times, and I felt like North Florida had the most of that to offer. I wanted it to have a contemporary feeling, contemporary characters, and yet still some of the old things like the old, you know, little barbecue stands you used to see on the side of the road, and little junk stores, and, you know, just little towns where there was no such thing as a McDonald's, you know, and people grew up, you know, eating at home or going out to little places like that. Bait stores, you know, all that old stuff, and yet it was still a contemporary world. So I took a woman from Miami and put her in that environment.
Oh, that's a big
And transition. I could do it believably up there because there is still that. You know, you can still find that, although it is growing rapidly away. And then I went into some of the aspects of not faith healing, but herbal medicine, and finally pushed past that into I guess what you would call voodoo, or, you know, because that still goes on too. You know, the love charms, the real harmless stuff. When I pushed it a little further than that.
Marie Laveau stuff from New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, it's not that far away.
It's close enough, you know.
And, you know, but, you know, there's no doctors and there's no, you know, people do tend to go for that sort of thing, and it still happens. I found out recently it still goes on in Virginia, where we live in a rural area, that's fairly common too, so there's more material, but I wanted to explore that. I've always been fascinated by that.
A lot of research involved, and, you know, and how do you go about researching voodoo? I'd like to ask you some questions about, you know.
It's very difficult. Not too many people want to talk about it. Mostly reading for that. And talking to people, mostly older people who were a wealth of information, you know, remembering things from their childhood, and knowing people, you know, you could talk to people and without them giving you names, they could say, oh yeah, this used to go on or that. And you could tell they were talking about now, because they'd always preface it, well, now of course I never believed in this, but, you know, and then the way they told it, you just knew that they did, you know, it's really interesting. So I did that kind of research, sort of oral history type things almost.
Now there's an interesting story about when you wrote the book. It took you years. Did
Yeah.
you write constantly?
Well, yes, I was working, let's see, this was my first, out of graduate school, this was my first job. I was a librarian at the state hospital in Chattahoochee, which is, west of
Over in
Tallahassee, in that
sure.
area, yeah. And that was my long drive. It was 50 miles each way and
that's
down
where you
winding country
composed it.
roads. And that's when I started telling myself the story, which eventually became the novel. But I did work on it every day. I was going to taking other graduate courses too, so it took me years and years. And then I worked away at it for about 2 years or so, and did finally finish. Then once I finished, I really didn't know what to do with it. I mean, I knew I should send it off, but I just somehow couldn't get up the nerve or the, whatever, I put it away.
Well, I think that would be pretty traumatic, okay? You've been writing and you
Yeah.
harbor these secret fantasies, these secret dreams, and then you got to kind of cut the cord and ship it off to a publisher.
Yeah, what I wanted to do, I think I had even more at stake at that. I wanted to write a horror novel. I wanted to write the book that I always wanted to read but could never find. And
love
I
those
wanted it to be a great story. I didn't want it to exist solely for, the horror, and it's kind of limited in there. It's probably what you call soft horror. It's marketed under suspense, actually. I wanted the story to rule, not the special effects. I didn't want to have an exploding head every 5 pages or something. I didn't want that to be the reason for the book to exist. So I think I was worried that once I sent it off that, maybe I was on the wrong track, or I would be proved wrong that this wasn't, the book of my dreams or something. So you're probably right. I think I had a lot invested in it, and it made me very nervous to think that it, ultimately would be turned down.
And it was turned down initially.
It was turned down initially. I did send it off. Finally, I got up the nerve. I sent it off 2 or 3 times. Didn't know what I was doing. Kind of sent it off blindly and got letters back, which at the time was a good sign. I didn't know that, and so I put it away. And later on, my husband encouraged me to take it out again and revise it. And
Years later?
Yes, years. It was about 6 years later, I think, and an agent looked at it and liked it and sold it to the 4th publisher he showed it to.
How about that? So that's a success story.
I was thrilled.
I would be too.
So,
I was pleased.
And you must be thrilled also when you published your first book after writing for different periodicals, worldwide magazines to be sure. You're talking Reader's Digest. I mean, that's got a huge readership. But to make that transition from articles into your first book, Trapped in a Cave, and it's a true life story. Now,
yes, it is.
where did you hear about this? Did you interview the little boy that happened
Yeah,
to?
I actually wrote it for Reader's Digest first as an article.
There you go.
And I'll tell you, I had always said that I never, all these people have a novel inside them. I always said, no. People said, I want to write a book. I really want to do this. And I said, I don't want to write a book. It just wasn't something I particularly wanted to do. But when I went to Tampa to interview this family for Reader's Digest, and then when I went to West Virginia and crawled around that cave.
You went to the cave. You actually went to the cave.
As many times as I can, I go and reenact what happened so that I can have some accurate sensory descriptions.
Sure.
And the more that I studied this story and met these people and talked with them, the more intrigued I was by the point of view of the 13-year-old boy. Because in writing it for Reader's Digest, of course, I was writing it from an adult point of view. Mainly the father's thoughts and his fears.
Now, basically, this is about a family that's trapped in a cave, lost in a cave after
Right.
their light goes out, and the father is on heart medication?
Yeah, it's a father, his 2 sons. He's a widower. And this is really the first time that they've gone out as a family to do something fun since the death of the wife. So this was kind of like a springing back into life. He was an experienced spelunker, cave explorer, 20 years experience. He took the boys to a cave, and basically it was a case of familiarity breeding a little bit of sloppiness because they reached a point in the cave where it was a real tight squeeze, and the father made the decision to leave the emergency pack behind. And one of the things with caves, when you're underground, there is no light. It isn't just dark, it's total absence of light. If you don't have a light, you do not come out. You cannot find your way.
You would have to pry the emergency pack out of my hand.
Yeah, well, the thing was they each had on a headlamp. He had just reloaded it with fresh carbide. This is a granular fuel that water drips down on, and it makes, it's like little acetylene torches, okay?
Okay, so there's light.
They had 20 minutes, easy on those things. They were just going to go 5 minutes in, 5 minutes out, 10 minutes, fat time there, where if anything went wrong, they had plenty of time. Well, one by one, right after another, all 3 of their lamps malfunctioned and went out. The fuel was bad. They are assuming that it had gotten damp at some point, and so it didn't last as long as it should have. And the underground, navigating underground, most cavers don't use visuals. Like, they don't ever make marks on the walls or anything. If anything, they make tape arrows that they pick up on their way out. But most experienced cavers navigate by simply memorizing the terrain. When they go in, each time they turn, they look back and memorize landmarks.
But they weren't really in there long enough to...
Oh yeah, they were in there, and he memorized them. But the problem is, once the lamps started going out, the combination of thinking why he left the emergency pack, hurrying, which you should not do underground because it makes you make mistakes, he took a wrong turn. So not only now did they have no lights, but they were lost in what is literally called the maze. It's a maze section, just like a honeycomb. And when the lights went out, when the last light went out, definitively, they were absolutely trapped. They had no food, no water, and the father did not have his heart medicine with him. So
I'm hooked.
Yeah, the 13-year-old boy ended up having to take a lot of adult responsibilities because his father started going downhill real fast by the third day. And I was just very intrigued with his point of view. And even though I had said I never wanted to write a book, I just had to. It was one that needed to be told. And so I sat down and knocked it out and thoroughly enjoyed it. I wrote it in his words, and it was just like being a kid again.
That's interesting because it couldn't be contained in an article, is what you're saying. Like I said, my story couldn't be contained in a poem or even a short story, so it's just as long-winded as me.
Yeah, I think there's a common trait here.
No, sometimes I think you just, the subject matter.
I want to point out.
No, I think she's got a point.
No, I think the subject matter sometimes just doesn't lend itself to whatever you've been working on, and you have to move into something new.
That's true. Well, it's always good to have a place to kind of grow, too. You don't want to be trapped in the same kind of format that you've been working in.
Trapped in an article.
With no lights.
Cute. So now these real-life adventures have kind of taken off and scoped into real adventures for real kids.
Real kids, real adventures, yes. And I'm very excited about that.
Are there a lot of these going around out there?
Everywhere. They're everywhere. Kids are a natural for getting into trouble.
Are you kidding?
Yeah.
Well, but there's trouble, and then there's being lost in a cave for days, you know?
Well, kids go out in blizzards with their dogs, like a boy in Nebraska.
In their underwear.
Yeah, in a T-shirt.
I don't want to know.
And then a blizzard comes up and they're trapped. Kids are in planes that crash over the desert or in the ocean. Kids just are where trouble is. You can often find a kid. And many times you find a kid who's either very heroic or very cool-headed. I've got a 9-year-old boy who crawled through fire at an apartment to save some babies. A lot of people are talking about kids making headlines now doing bad things.
Right.
But the thing I like about Real Kids, Real Adventures, it's kids making headlines doing good things.
Well, and it's good because kids will read the book. It might give them some ideas on how to act in a certain emergency.
It does.
You're doing a good
lot
thing.
of times they don't know their limitations. They don't know they shouldn't be doing something heroic or something creative or something exciting, so they go ahead and do it anyway. You know, even though we wouldn't have done that.
Above and beyond the call. Absolutely. Well, that sounds fascinating. You're also working or have worked on books. You've got Weirwood, which is the sequel.
Yes, that's a sequel. It's more of a geographical sequel. It's set in the same area, and I'm actually, it's interesting because there's a story that I'd read about that's in the news recently, and I had decided to write this book about 8 years ago, and I'm just now getting around to doing that and finishing it, and now this story has come up again in the news, so it's almost as if I'd planned it. Oh, it's a real interesting thing. It's based on a small town where a massacre happened. Oh. It's Florida history.
There you go, being morbid again.
Oh, it has a happy ending.
Now you gave it away.
But it's actually a real life thing. I'm not writing nonfiction, but I'm basing it, and that's where we get our ideas. I mean, there are ideas everywhere, but often a newspaper article can be the catalyst for a novel.
Yeah. So. Do you have any advice for people that might be thinking or considering or currently working on a novel? I mean, here you've overcome rejection to go on and be writing a series, and you yourself just started off writing articles based on something you thought was interesting, and here it's kind of boomeranged.
Well, it's real important to not give up. I mean, I was lucky. 4 rejections is nothing. My husband, I think, was rejected 15 times before his first novel was published. Stephen King was rejected something like 25 times. Louis L'Amour something like 80 times. I mean, you just have to be persistent.
I feel better.
I think some people, 1 or 2, and they think, oh my gosh, I wasn't cut out for this. And I mean, it's easy to get wounded, especially when you don't know what you're doing.
You're just starting out.
You feel stupid to start, to start with. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I think persistence is important, and a lot of people have an idea that writing is a real glamorous occupation. They see the movies,
Tom
they see,
Clancy.
They see, Jane Fonda as a writer in the movie, drinking and typing on a typewriter, and it's not like that. It's hard work, and you just have to sit down every day as you're going into an office, and just planning yourself there and working away, even if you don't feel like it.
I've heard that before, that you have to treat it just like a job, that you kind of clock in at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you will work until 5 o'clock.
If you don't, you will never finish anything. So it's distinctly unglamorous. it's just hard work.
Well, the
and
end result.
revision.
I thought it was glamorous. That's what I do every day.
Well, you got 4 children. Everything seems glamorous.
I'm lying.
No, it is. I mean, it has its moments. I mean, here we are, in our, in this glamorous
feel
spotlight.
glamorous.
But yeah, I do too.
Oh,
But
good.
usually I'm wearing
She looks
jeans and a ripped
glamorous.
You look
T-shirt,
Let's face it, girls, we're all glamorous.
There you go.
How about you? Any words for people that might get started? Just take a look at everything that's around you.
Yes. A lot of what she said about looking in the newspaper and everything and being inspired by real events, that's very important. I'm just going to add to what you said about rejections. One of the things I do when I go speak in elementary schools is I bring in my office trash can, because my office trash can is laminated with rejection notices that I've cut down to size, the whole thing, just a collage of rejection notices with my favorite in the middle that refers to my work as bland. Anyway.
So you need to have kind of a thick skin?
Oh, you have to, and you also have to be willing to revise. I always break out in a cold sweat when young writers come up and start talking about their work like it's carved in stone. You can't have that attitude if you're going to be a professional. You have to be ready to revise. You have to be able to write to order. If your editor tells you, change this, you can negotiate, but the bottom line is the one who writes the check gets to pick, okay? And if you can't take that, and if you're going to cling to every word as being precious, you're not going to be able to make a living anyway, I don't think.
When you look at it like a work of art.
And you can see that in writers' workshops where, there's always someone who gets offended and stomps out of the room. They're never going to be a writer. They're too sensitive, or they've already decided they already know, everything. And once they write it down, it doesn't need to be changed, and it's just not. It's not that way. I mean, like you said, there's room for negotiation. In fiction, the same is true. They may make suggestions for changes. If you take offense at everything and say, I'm not going to do it, you'll still publish that book, but you may not publish another one.
Right.
It's good to look at suggestions and at least consider them. And usually, there's merit in at least some of it. I mean, you have to be willing to work with that and not. Get on your high horse and say, well, I'm writing this book. They can't tell me what to do.
Yeah,
I'm an artist. Attitude, yeah. I mean,
that artist attitude doesn't work commercially.
Yeah. Well, not if you want to
I don't
get
think
the
it works
checks,
for artists either, frankly. I think it's another one of those movie things,
Well, aside from having the kids and all, the things that womanhood, in addition to writing, makes you do, have you encountered any kind of sexism or any kind of difficulty for women entering the business?
I haven't personally. I think that it probably exists to some extent. Like I think we were talking about this earlier. If I'm writing a horror fiction, which actually used to be a pretty male-dominated field, but that has gradually changed, and I've come in on the where it's been changing, and I haven't noticed any problem with that. I do know there are fields like male adventure was what we were thinking of, like techno thrillers or something. If you'll notice, you don't see too many of those, if any. None come to mind with women's names on them. Now, some women may be writing them, but if they are, they're using men's names.
Sure.
On the other hand, I think that it sort of works the other way too. Men writing romances are writing under women's names. Yeah, right. Well, yeah. He's now
an
maybe
exception.
that's the that may be the turning point. Maybe that's going to be acceptable now. But I think it's all a matter of what's acceptable at the time. And these days, almost anything's acceptable. Women in sports, women writing about sports, that's fine. If, a few decades ago, that would have been unheard of.
Right.
So I think there probably still is some, but I think it's in real specific areas.
But nobody thinking you just need to keep the little woman at home there with the kids,
I haven't I really haven't run into any of that. I've been treated pretty fairly across the board by my editors. And the few that I've run into that were unpleasant, there were some women, some men, I just don't work with them. I mean, that's easy enough. You can pick and choose, and it's just because of the way they are, not necessarily any big sexism thing. So.
Now, what about pseudonyms? This is kind of a weird question of mine, because I know that Stephen King used to write under Richard Bachman for a while before he went back. And you yourself use a pseudonym. You use Elizabeth Graves. Why?
That's true. Well, yeah, Elizabeth is my middle name. Graves is a family name. It was a marking decision.
Sounds
basically.
kind of macabre there in the Graves.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's sort of there. That's not why I chose it. Actually, I like Robert Graves, and I thought that was a good sign, and since that name was in my family. But I decided, after talking to other writers who had experienced problems, when you write in a specific genre like horror is, or science fiction, or romance, you tend to get typed. I call it the Stephen King syndrome. Right. If Stephen King wanted to write a romance,
well, this way you can kind of do whatever you want.
Right, serious literature. He doesn't get a chance because he's Stephen King. He can't write anything else. And publishers have a tendency to want you to keep doing the same thing, especially if it's successful, and not change. So I decided, having written many other things under my own name, I would reserve that for more general things.
Give
And
you
when
your
I branched
freedom.
out into specifics like that, or if I took up romance or or whatever, I would use a different name. And then if that if that didn't work out, that pseudonym could kind of go,
Makes
and I'd
sense.
still be Lenore Hart. So
Now I know. Thank you for joining us. Lenore Hart, Deborah Morris, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And thanks for joining us on Writer to Writer. It's been presented by Florida Community College in Jacksonville. Thanks for joining us.